Good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to see such a strong turnout. I'm just here on behalf of the Department of German and Dutch to welcome you all and to introduce Erica Wickerson. Erica, as some of you know, is a research fellow at St John's College, and she's written on literature from the 19th century to the present, on graphic novels and on film. Her first book, The Architecture of Narrative Time, came out last year with Oxford University Press. And she's going to talk to us today about a project that I know she's very, very passionate about, and we're really looking forward to hearing from you, Erica. So, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Charlotte, and thank you all for coming today, particularly in the sunny weather. So I'm going to be talking about three apparently very different works, and that is part of the point of this project. I'm going to be talking about Orange is the New Black, The Godfather, and Buddenbrooks. And I'm going to be looking at the theme of the business and the family and how these are intertwined in these three works, and what these also tell us more generally about society, power, and culture. So I'm going to start with a brief introduction to the works and the issues for those of you who aren't familiar with all of them. Jenji Kohan's Orange is the New Black is a very popular Netflix TV series that's been going since 2013 and has just announced the final season. It's set in a women's prison in present-day America. We more or less, at least in the first few seasons, follow the life of Piper Chapman, who's the protagonist, and it was on Piper Kerman's memoir that the series is based. But it doesn't just explore life in the prison, but it also includes flashbacks to the lives of the prisoners before their sentences. So we see, roughly speaking, how they ended up in prison. Francis Ford Coppola's Godfather trilogy is a cinematic classic. And this explores the lives of a Sicilian-American mafia family through a substantial part of the 20th century. It looks at the changing social climates across the different generations. We have this generational divide. And also, like Orange is the New Black, particularly Godfather 2, includes flashbacks to Don Vito Corleone's youth and childhood, so we see how he became a mafia don. And I'm also going to be looking at Thomas Mann's Buddenbrooks. So Thomas Mann was a Nobel Prize-winning German author who was one of the key European modernists, and Buddenbrooks was his first novel. It came out in 1901. And it looks at a family of 19th century grain merchants across several generations. It starts at the height of their power and success and then charts the family's decline over the several generations. So apparently these works are completely different. They're created in different contexts, they're told from different perspectives, they're about different subjects, they're in different media. They apparently have very little in common. But this makes their similarities all the more interesting. All three explore structures of the family. So either these are biologically given or they are socially defined, socially chosen. So for example, in Orange is the New Black, we have this sort of modern conception of the family of choice. And it is typically defined in sort of racist terms by implied ethnic origin and skin colour. And the notions of the family are very much intertwined with business lives. All three show us conceptions of good business, bad business, legality and morality. With this comes questions of power. So these three works explore who is in control, how power is maintained, and how power is passed on across different generations. So today there are three parts to this talk. Firstly, I'm going to be looking at structures of power. Then the notion of inflexibility and fragility and how the inflexibility of these families and businesses potentially actually spells their doom. It implies their fragility. And then finally, constructions of symbols and motifs. So structures of power. What's interesting, despite these differences, is how similar the constructions of power are in these three works. In all three, we have these sort of pyramid structures with a matriarch or a patriarch at the top, and then the subsequent generations down at the bottom. Power is transmitted over time. But also you have competing pyramids, competing families and businesses who are vying for ultimate control and dominance. Particularly we see this in The Godfather, but there's the threat of treachery, of traitors, family disloyalty, and this tension between duty and basically passion, desires, private desires. We also have in all three works the notion of the outsider, members of the family unit who do not fit in. And again, this is tied up with the notion of fragility and the ways in which the declines of the families and businesses are foreshadowed early on. So in Orange is the New Black, I'm going to concentrate particularly on season 2. Firstly, I think it's probably the best season of the series, but also it most emphatically explores this relationship between the business and the family. It also has a wonderful antagonist, V, who is introduced at the beginning of season 2. She enters the prison as if she's new, but actually we later discover she was in many years before. And she quickly takes over as the sort of matriarch of what's known as the Black Girls group, or the Black Girls family. So her daughters are Tasty, Suzanne, Cindy, and Watson. There's another figure who acts as an outsider figure, who I'm going to come to later. But here we don't just have V's family. She starts up a drug smuggling business. She's smuggling in drugs from outside the prison and is trying to deal them amongst the prisoners. And this is considered a kind of bad business, much like The Godfather, the notion of a sort of immoral you have different scales of illegality where all smuggling into the prison is bad, but the drugs are considered, well, in the words of Don Corleone from The Godfather, a dirty business. And she's vying for control, the ultimate control of the prison hierarchy, with other families. Red's family, who we're going to come to later, Mendoza's family, known as the Spanish Girls, and then you also have the family of the older prisoners who don't really compete so much, but tend to back up Red's family. There's a very similar construction of power in The Godfather, with Don Vito Corleone, and then his sons, Sonny, Michael, Fredo, and his adopted son, Tom Hagen. And here again you have the competing pyramids, so it's not only the Corleones but several other mafia families that are all competing for ultimate control. Here, most emphatically, out of these three works, you have the fear of treachery, that rogue elements from the family are going to go across, betray their family, let secrets out, put hits out on them, and this again is part of the family fragility is the word I'm looking for. In Buddenbrooks, we have a more typical family tree structure, and this is how power is created. So very briefly, you have the family tree of Johann Senior, married to Antoinette, Jean, also known as Johann, and Elizabeth have Thomas, Christian, and Tony, known as Tony. Her full name is Anthony, a girl. And you have a subsequent generation as well, but the power is really found before this line. It ends pretty much with Thomas. His son Hanno, by the end of the book, effectively chooses to die. He submits to an illness, and with him the Buddenbrooks line dies out. And the Buddenbrooks compete with the Hagenstroms, and so at the beginning of the novel they are the ones in control, but by the end the Hagenstroms dominate and the Buddenbrooks are basically wiped out, and they even buy the family home. Inflexibility and fragility. What's interesting about these three works is the ways in which they also play on tropes, common themes of fiction and narrative more generally. So in all three situations, and this has a lot to do with the audience experience, the audience identification and empathy, they all begin with a recognisable social event. So in Orange is the New Black, Piper, our protagonist, has just got engaged to be married, and her best friend Polly is pregnant. In The Godfather, we have the opening wedding scene of Connie, Vito Corleone's only daughter. And in the Buddenbrooks, you have this housewarming party. It's kind of a celebration of their prosperity and their success. So what this means in all of these situations is we have this sort of Othello-like construction of hubris. They are at the heights of their power. It feels like everything is looking great, going towards the future. The only way it can go is basically down. We also have in all three the introduction of an outsider figure in some sense, someone with whom the audience can identify. We are taken into a new environment, a new social situation, and things are explained for this outsider figure's benefit, but also for us, the audience. So, for example, Piper in Orange is the New Black is entering the prison for the first time. She's shown to be naive and ignorant, much as we, the audience, are implicitly. In The Godfather, Michael Corleone, the son of Vito, is known as a civilian. He's a war hero. He has nothing to do with the business initially. And at the wedding, he brings along his girlfriend, Kay. And the family and the business is all entirely new and horribly alienating for Kay. She can't quite believe the idea of people being bumped off just to, help with a business deal. And so things are explained for her benefit and also for us, the audience. And in Buddenbrooks, it starts with this kind of this celebration, and they say that typically the family come together on, I think, a Thursday, but on this occasion they're bringing in house guests as well. You also have the rogue element in the family, and again this affects audience identification. The rogue element also ultimately spells the family's downfall. So this affects the notion of inflexibility and fragility and the lines between the business and the family. This line becomes particularly blurred in Orange is the New Black. So I mentioned an outsider figure. This is Poussey. She is basically a member of the black girl's family, but when V enters the prison, she is uncomfortable. She is the most profoundly uncomfortable with the idea of dealing drugs. And she doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And this begins a showdown with V, the matriarch, who wants to thus eject her from the family, not only the business, but also the family. So I'm going to show a clip. There are a few things to look out for here. The music, is there music? Isn't there music? When the music starts, do you notice anything in particular about it? What does the point of view do for our experience as the spectators? What happens at the start and end of each scene, whose perspective is prioritised, and is there anything significant about the camera style and camera movement?
You in or out? The library is prime real estate for us.
Look, you got your spot. Deal out of there.
There's no reason for the inmates to flow through the warehouse. There's no excuse to browse. Plus, the hack's got a taste of blood. It's only a matter of time before they sweep all the work sites.
I ain't no corner girl.
I like this spot. So you either get your ass in line or request a transfer. I hear electrical is looking. You feel me?
I ain't going nowhere. You feel me?
While it's fresh in your mind, the music there actually sets up a musical motif with an earlier part of the series. You've got this lone guitar, just a single note coming in, which is reminiscent of this sort of Western showdown at dawn of kind of cowboy films. And indeed, this isn't just pure speculation, but we've heard this kind of musical trope earlier in the series when V, that matriarch, encounters Red, the other significant matriarch in the series, for the first time in years. This is ironising the Western showdown here. the title of that episode is Hugs Can Be Deceiving. And this is one of the points, one of the things that recurs throughout Orange is the New Black, the deceptive nature of appearances. What we have in the echo of this Western-style music between Pusey and V in the library is the threat of a showdown. This isn't just about the control of space in the library, that you cannot deal your drugs out of here. It's also promising a conflict, a major conflict between V and Pusey. We know this because this Hugs Can Be Deceiving hug that we see here is prefacing, if this is the right word, a flashback to years before when these two women first met in prison and initially appeared to be friends, but it ended with V terribly badly beating up Red and taking over her business, taking control of the prison hierarchy effectively. So this is foreshadowed simply in that lone note of the guitar. What we also have in this library scene, as we do throughout this series with the slow ejection of Pusey and other figures who cross V effectively, is that the scene opens and ends with a concentration on Pusey. We are given particular access to Pusey's perspective. We're being told how to read this. Throughout cinema and TV, the over-the-head shots like this is incredibly common. It gives us the sense of being an eavesdropper on a conversation. But what we have by the end of the scene, as the camera zooms in to Tasty, who's the woman in the hoodie in the background, Tasty is Pusey's, not only her best friend, but also the woman she loves. She's in love with her. And homophobia is actually part of V's point of ejecting Pusey out of the family. We have the camera moves in so close into the back of Pusey's head, it's like we're entering her head. We're certainly given privileged and prioritized access to Pusey's perspective. This scene indicates or presents the downfall that is being anticipated here, the beating of Pusey. It's a really horrible scene, unfortunately. Again, camera angle, camera movement is particularly significant here.
Don't touch her!
Yeah, it's a horrible scene. It's very hard to watch. What is particularly noticeable here is the way in which the camera is echoing and empathizing with Pusey's perspective. We are being thrown about as she is being thrown about. I mean, our level of pain is obviously not analogous, but we're seeing things from her perspective. This recurs repeatedly throughout this series when V betrays or rejects or ejects one of the members of her family who she purportedly is meant to be protecting in the prison family system. The camera will not only show things from the over-the-head perspective, but actually from the perspective of that character. And it never does this with V. V is always shown to be an impervious, cold, unreadable figure almost. Again, the start and end of this scene, I didn't show it because she's being sick, begins and ends with Pusey's perspective. As the other women leave the bathroom, we are left with Pusey on the floor. So this adds to the sense of the prioritization of her perspective. So what you've got here are profoundly blurred lines between the business and the family, and you can't basically belong to one and not the other with any ease. Pusey doesn't agree with the drugs business, so she's ejected from the family. And we see things from her perspective in lots of subtle ways. This isn't just a question of us being presented with a morally black and white situation. The camera is basically telling us how to read the situation and prioritizing a particular perspective. This is quite different from The Godfather, at least in the opening of The Godfather, Godfather Part 1. So The Godfather Part 1, which is the one I'm concentrating on here, shows the progression from Don Vito Corleone to his son Michael and the transmission of power. And there is a profound contrast set up, not just in terms of business events and the way they carry out the business world, but also in lots of subtle ways to do with visual symbols and camera angles and musical motifs that suggest a contrast between Vito and Michael. In this opening scene, we have Vito conducting his underworld business in the darkened room in the house while his daughter is getting married outside. And I'm going to show a short clip here. Again, things to look out for. Lighting. Is there anything significant about the contrast? Is there anything significant about the clothing, the costumes they're wearing? What does nature do in this scene? Whose point of view is given priority? And what is the effect of the sound contrast?
Give this to Clemente. I want reliable people that aren't going to be carried away. I mean, we're not murderers, in spite of what this undertaker says.
So the contrast is quite clearly stark here. So we have this very emphatically dark, I mean, it's almost hard to pick things out here, but there's this iconic image of him in his darkened room conducting his business, in contrast to the brightly lit, not only lit by sunlight, but also this sort of wedding celebratory fairy lights view of the wedding. This contrast between the close-up a conversation perspective where we are another interlocutor in the situation, privy to this private conversation, compared to the zoomed out bird's eye view from above. The stark difference in clothing is also it also blends into the surroundings effectively. So the tuxedos in the back room actually blend into the background, whereas although the men are still wearing these black colours out in the wedding photo, they're overpowered by the soft pinks and the whites of the wedding party and the kind of objectified, removed from natural surroundings flower on his lapel is kind of overpowered by all of these trees and bunches of flowers in the wedding scene. You also have this profound contrast between the iconically husky, whispered private conversation we hear in the back room and then the indistinct chatter of the crowds out in the wedding. So what we have here is a clear impression of Vito as a character. He maintains the distinction between the family and the business, and it is shown as a stark distinction in this opening. This is reflected in light, camera, symbols, and perspective here. And what we see here is that this mirrors Vito's character, and this sets up the subsequent contrast with his son, Michael. In Buddenbrooks, we have another kind of indistinction between the tension between love and duty. So what is best for the family and the business and what the characters actually want to do, what they most desire. And I'm just going to look at a couple of passages here that I think suggest this. Tony is the character that we follow from the very start to the very end. So she's a child in the beginning of the book, and she's much older, obviously, by the end of the book, and leaving the family home. Morten Schwarzkopf is the young man with whom she is in love, and she wants to marry. But her family wants her to marry a man called Grünlich. The sea has particular significance in Mann's works, and we see this also profoundly in Buddenbrooks. It's representing a place of freedom away from the constraints of duty and work and school and this kind of regularity back home. And so the sea is particularly important here as well. So this is quite a long passage, but I'm just going to read it to you. It is remarkable, this is Tony speaking, it is remarkable how one cannot get bored at the seashore, Morton. Try lying anywhere else for 3 or 4 hours at a time, flat on your back, doing nothing, not even pursuing a single thought. Autumn was at hand. The first strong wind had risen. Thin, tattered grey clouds raced across the sky. The dreary, tossing sea was covered far and wide with foam. Great, powerful waves rolled silently in, relentless, awesome, towered majestically in a metallic dark green curve, then crashed thundering on the sand. Tony and Morton spent the afternoon in a distant spot at the edge of the yellow loam, where the waves hurled their spray as far up as Seagull Rock. Morton had made her a solid sandcastle, and she leaned against it with her back, her feet in their strap shoes and white stockings crossed in front of her. Morton lay turned toward her, his chin in his hands. Now and then a seagull flew past them, shrieking. They looked at the green wall of waves streaked with seaweed that came threateningly on and then broke against the opposing boulders with the eternal confused tumult that deafens and silences and destroys all sense of time. So what we have here is the construction of a sense of timelessness. Here, boredom is put on hold. It does not follow the normal rules of the clock. The sea is described as relentless. There is this sense of eternity. And in the final line, the eternal confused tumult that deafens and silences and destroys all sense of time. By the sea, we are not subject to the normal rules of everyday life. This is also, in terms of natural images, a profoundly powerful and wild and exciting moment. The first strong wind had risen. The sea was covered far and wide with foam. There were great, powerful waves. It was awesome. It towered majestically. The sea crashed thundering on the sand. This is really exciting. This represents the passion that Tony is feeling for Morton. But at the same time, this is not just an image of power and delight and excitement, but also of destruction and threat. You've got the clouds that are tattered. This crashed thundering also spells a kind of destruction. The waves came threateningly and broke against the opposing boulders. We've got this idea of breaking again, and the confused tumult that deafens and silences and destroys. This is also a kind of warning that this relationship is not sustainable. It is not for the good of the family, the benefit of the progression of lineage. In contrast to that imagery of excitement and danger, we have incongruously this description of Tony in the midst of it all, her feet in their strap shoes and white stockings crossed in front of her. It's the image of propriety and constraint, the idea of being not only the strapped shoes but encased in stockings, her legs are crossed. It feels very out of place in this wild imagery. And most significantly of all, Morton has built her a solid sandcastle. So the symbolism, the significance of this is an attempt at a fortress, a kind of mode of protection, but of course it's made of sand. This sense of eternity, the passion they feel, is actually transitory. It's an illusion. This is in profound contrast to her other suitor here, Herr Grünlich. From the middle of the ceiling hung the well-cut model of a ship under full sail. Herr Grünlich, his ulster tightly buttoned up, his hat on his knees, sat bolt upright on the edge of the sofa. Herr Captain, began Herr Grünlich, wagging his head with determination and throwing himself back on his seat. After this he was silent again, and by way of enhancing the effect of his address, he shut his mouth tight, like a purse drawn together with strings. Herr Captain, he repeated, and went on without further pause. The matter about which I have come to you directly concerns the young lady who has been for some weeks stopping in your house. Mademoiselle Buddenbrooks, asked the captain. Precisely, assented Herr Grünlich. He looked down at the floor and spoke in a voice devoid of expression. Hard lines came out of the corners of his mouth. This is the fact, so I am informed, Herr Grünlich said, with dreary certitude. I hear that your son, studius medicinae, pardon my Latin, I am led to understand, has allowed himself, of course unconsciously, to encroach upon my rights. I hear that he has taken advantage of the present visit of the young lady to extract certain promises from her. I repeat that my time is limited and the carriage waits. Herr Krünig, with measured tread, passed between Morton and his mother and went out the door. So this scene is massively cut down. There are quite a few bits I had to take out there. But basically, Herr Krünig has got word of Tony's interest in Morton and has quickly come over to try and put a stop to it. An interesting fact here is that Tony is actually asleep upstairs, which really typifies her interest in Krünig. That's how excited she is by his arrival and his presence. But we also have, it opens with this image of the well-cut model of a ship. Here, the excitement and the terror and the passion of the sea that we saw with Morton is now objectified, reduced, and turned into this pathetic little model that is very evenly in the middle of the ceiling. The description of Krünig, again, contrasts profoundly with the sea associated with Morton. Everything about him is uptight and proper, his ulster tightly buttoned up, his hat on his knees sat bolt upright. He shut his mouth tight, like a purse drawn together with strings. This also anticipates the fact he really is only interested in Tony for her money. He's actually in debt and he wants the Buddenbrooks' fortune. Again, the hard lines emphasise this straightness that we've got with Krünig. His face is also devoid of expression. It's the very antithesis of the excitement of the sea. He repeats several times throughout this paragraph, this passage, a particular word. So here he says, my time is limited. The German original here is gemessen, translated directly as measured. And we have that again in the final line, with measured tread. And so in contrast to the sense of eternity, where time is put on hold and boredom cannot occur, that Tony feels with Morton, we have this very measured duty-bound time associated with Krünig. So what we have here is that the lines between the family and the business are difficult to maintain in all three cases, and this is what will eventually spell their downfall. Some of the characters threaten these carefully built structures of power, and this foreshadows the future demise of the three families here. So in this third section, we're now going to look at the construction of symbols and motifs. Orange is New Black. Perhaps the most profoundly obvious symbol that recurs throughout, or leitmotif, is the use of colour. So I'm taking leitmotif in a particular sense. Thomas Mann basically built on Wagnerian leitmotifs of the 19th century that he used in his music dramas. And he imposed them onto, he adopted them and adapted them in a literary form. So here I refer to particular images with added symbolic significance that are repeated throughout. This is significant in these works because these are works about different generations. You have a sense of continuity over time provided by a repeated image or a repeated motif, but it also slightly changes, and this gives us a sense of development over time. Colour in Orange is the New Black is important in all sorts of ways. We have clique formation. As I mentioned earlier, people self-identify as particular families or even have it imposed by others upon them in terms of their skin colour. But you also have the creation of the prison hierarchy. So the prisoners wear beige, kind of homogeneous, dehumanizing clothing. The guards wear blue to mark them out. The very high up members of the prison hierarchy get to wear their own clothes, so tend to be sort of dark suits. And new prisoners wear bright orange to mark them out as new. You also have, in pretty much every scene, and there were lots of choices to look at here, beige backgrounds. So most of the spaces within the prison are actually this homogenizing, dehumanizing beige that blends with the characters' clothing. So the dorms, the showers, the cafeteria. the library actually tends to be a place that the books provides this sort of spatial backdrop that actually marks it out as a place of greater identity potential, and this is how it's seen to a lot of the prisoners. But also, one of the things about this show is that appearances can be deceiving, and we see this in the symbolic use of colour. So, for example...
Welcome back, actually.
I talked over it there, but she said, "Welcome to prison." When V arrives, she's wearing the bright orange garb of the new prisoners, and she is taken as non-threatening, as naive, as new, but this is deceptive. As I said earlier, there are flashbacks to the lives of the prisoners before they entered prison, and Tasty, one of the girls who is V's prison daughter, was also in fact her foster daughter outside the prison. This next scene shows their first meeting, where V, basically a predator, was going to an adoption fair in order to groom children to use in her drug business. And this is the first time they meet.
That looks vile.
It looked blue, but it tastes like red.
Blue and red are colors, darling. They're not flavors.
Well, it's tasty. I like me something tasty, especially on days like now. People only want the babies.
Of course they want the babies. Babies are cute.
I'm cute.
No, you're big. And your hair's ratsy, and you're too eager and too dark. And now your mouth is blue. But I suppose it tastes like red.
You nasty.
So Tasty actually here, as a child, is getting at a more significant truth than most of the adults in the prison do, which is that appearances can be deceptive. It's actually acutely insightful that it looks blue, but it tastes red. I mean, it's about the artifice of the flavours in part, but also that's what she's saying to V. So V comes along to these adoption fairs, she enters prison, she acts like people's friend, but actually, as Tasty as a child says here, "You nasty." This is all putting on an appearance. She's not the only one who is aware of the power of appearances and the ability to manipulate things. So a lot of the prisoners use colour, subtle uses of colour, in order to express identity in an otherwise dehumanising environment. So, for example, Morello, one of the characters, is always shown with this bright red, bright pink lipstick. But Red, whose name derives from her hair colour, is a particularly strong instance of this. So when she sees that V has returned to prison and we don't yet know their history, she wants to change her appearance to suggest far greater power than she at that moment has.
A woman I knew a long time ago came back in yesterday.
Oh, so you want to impress her?
More like intimidate her.
Don't fuck with me. I got just the color for that.
And then these.
So what we have in these three scenes is the deceptive use of colour. V is deemed harmless because of her prison uniform. The words of Tasty looks blue, tastes red, showing her character, but also her ability to see through the deceptive nature of appearances. And Red is using this in a more positive way, showing the power of appearances. So she knows, unlike most of the other characters, she knows from the years before what V is actually capable of, and she knows the necessity of hiding weakness from this predatory figure. So prison, on the one hand, enforces the loss of identity and creates a sense of exposure, but the women use colour, among other things, in a subtler symbolic way to create a sense of identity and to fight back these systems of power and coercion. The Godfather actually, in some ways, and this would be the subject of a whole other lecture, makes use of this sort of Wagnerian leitmotif structure in terms of its music. Does anyone fancy trying humming the Godfather theme tune? Oh, go on, there's a hand up there. I wasn't expecting that. Fabulous. Excellent. Yes. Was that recognisable to everyone? It was beautifully done. Thank you. Yes, so that is actually the love tune, the love theme from The Godfather. But my point there is that it's iconic. People know the Godfather soundtrack, and I think it was in fact nominated for an Oscar. What's really interesting about the music in The Godfather is how it recurs in different guises throughout the different films and across the different generations. So we have repetition, but we also have change and development. So it becomes associated with particular characters and themes, but also subtly changes. So there are two significant musical moments that I want to look at, rather than looking at the change of the theme over time. These are both intradiegetic musical moments. So by intradiegetic, and it's often also known as diegetic, I mean within the story they occur at the consciousness of the characters. The characters can hear this music as well. So for example, a band playing within a scene. And this is the opposite of extradiegetic, which kind of, if say you have a soundtrack beyond the character consciousness that we hear, but they don't. So there is a stark contrast, and I mentioned this a bit earlier, between Don Vito Corleone, the Godfather at the start of the film, and his son Michael, who takes over as head of the family by the end of the film. And this is set up between two major family events, both of which have this intradiegetic music. So as mentioned, it starts with a wedding, and what's interesting actually about the person who hummed the love theme tune is actually there's also a theme tune that is associated with business deals. Every time there's a seedy business deal, plans to bump someone off, there's another tune that I'm about to play and I won't sing, that recurs throughout. But what's interesting is the first time we hear this tune, it isn't anything to do with the business. It's actually the wedding dance of Connie and her father, Vito. And this is it.
Okay, that's it. Just like that now. Hold it.
This links up to the absolute classic of the cinema moment at the end of The Godfather Part 1, for those of you who don't remember it, this baptism scene where we see Michael Corleone now becoming a godfather himself, but as he is participating in the baptism of his sister's baby, interjected, punctuating this baptism, are the murders of the heads of the other mafia families. So it's him taking control of the other families as he becomes the godfather. It's a wonderful, well, it's quite a horrific scene, but cinematically wonderful. And again, here we have the intradiegetic music of an unseen organ playing in the background.
I've decided to be godfather of Connie's baby. And then I'll meet with Don Bazzini and Tatalia, all the heads of the 5 families.
It's a very long scene, so this is just a clip.
Exia Deo, el mundo y espíritu se da locum Espíritu Santo Paráclito. Oremus, precious nostros, per Christum Domine nostrum. Amen. Michael, Rucis Domine, in impression signatum, or the magnitudinous gloria tua rudimenta servans, per custodia mandatorum tuorum, ad regenerationis gloriam pervenire meriatur, per quiendum Christum Dominum nostrum. Amen. Oremus omnipotens sempiterne Deus, Pater Domini nostri Iesu Christi respice dignatus super hanc fambulum tuum Michael, qui venturis es judicari vivus et mortus saeculum perennium. Amen. Michael, agipe sal sapiense propitiasse tibi in vitam aeternam. Amen.
And thus the scene goes on, and then multiple people are bumped off. So what's interesting here is the symbolic use of colour. So I don't know if you noticed this, but in this scene, despite the multiple shots we're given of lots of different places, lots of different moments, lots of different people and environments, there is a very homogeneous use of colour. So here we have basically either a very subdued background colour, a sort of kind of beige background colour, or else just black, white and red. So here you not only have the ecclesiastical garb of the priest, but also the flowers in the corner of the scene are red. It's the only other colour we see there. And you have that echoed multiple times. Here there are other flowers, pink and yellow, but they are in shadow, while the ones that are lit up by the sunlight are red, and otherwise it's beige and black and white. Any time a colour other than beige and black and white appears, it's the red. So we've got the red of the ammunition box of one of the gunmen, the red of the background of this man who's about to be shot, the red of the flower in this guy's buttonhole, the red of this guy's shirt. So on one level, the red is symbolically anticipating the bloodshed that is about to occur. It's setting this up. But on another level, this sets up a profound contrast with the beginning of the film and with the original Godfather. And this occurs in other significant ways as well. So this scene is all about hypocrisy, but you have repeated symbolic cleaning occurring. So the car is even being polished in this sort of ironic moment on its way to carry out a murder. You also have multiple people, this police officer who is part of the execution squad, one of the hitmen, wiping away the sweat. This hitman wiping away the sweat of his brow. This hitman having a shave. This is all kind of, deeply ironic. Meanwhile, this poor baby is having its sins washed away with the baptismal water. In contrast to this, Michael, as you'll probably have noticed, is totally impassive, doesn't have a faint drop of sweat on his brow, even though he's the mastermind behind this hit. He's the one who's organised this mass shooting. So this, as I said, sets up a profound contrast with the start of the film. And we have the repeated motifs of shiny things and hypocrisy. So not only the shiny polished car, but the shiny gelled back hair of Michael's head, the shiny baptismal dress of the baby. And also, significantly, I said the background was beige. Actually, it was doing a bit of an injustice to this scene. It's gilded, it's golden, it's voluptuous and hedonistic. You've got gold and you've got marble. This is incredibly significant because it puts Michael on a par with his enemies and contrasts him with his father. He is a very different Godfather from his father. His enemies, as they are being shot, are shown in very similar surroundings of gold backgrounds. It looks actually a bit like Trump Towers, I imagine, but you've got the marble and the gold walls here. So the hedonism of Michael's rise to power, his conducting of the business, is now shown to be commensurate with that of his so-called enemies. He's on a par with them. The lines between business and the family are no longer distinct as they were with the black and the sunlight of his father. So here, could it be more different? This was his father's family occasion at the start. You've got brightly lit surroundings, you've got nature, you have soft colours. There's a profound contrast here. In Buddenbrooks, unlike the other two, we don't have these flashbacks to the characters' pasts, but time is constructed in another way. I mean, we do have the decline of the family over several generations. It's a linear narrative. But through the use of symbolism and motifs, we also have another kind of sense of time set up here. So the Buddenbrooks have this family book. So in this book, they basically record all of the births, deaths, divorces, and marriages of every member of the family. It basically symbolises this family, and it's gilded, and it's tightly encased, and it's uptight, and it kind of represents them. Tony, who I mentioned earlier, and her nephew Hanno are key figures in the decline of the family. Tony is someone, much like Michael Corleone in The Godfather, who embodies this tension between heart's desires and duty-bound kind of respect for the family business and the family continuation. She, like Michael, is someone who attempts to stay within the family and do what's best for them rather than doing what she wants to do and marrying the person she loves. Hanno is her nephew, and he wrestles with it in a different way, and it's a battle he ultimately doesn't win. Both of these characters symbolise these struggles and symbolise their attitudes to the family and the business in their interaction with this family book, and this has the effect of foreshadowing the future. We have a symbolic anticipation of what is to come. So here, I'm just going to read this quote. Tony grasped the pen, plunged it rather than dipped it into the ink, and wrote with her forefinger crooked, her hot head bent far over on her shoulder, in her awkward handwriting that climbed up the page from left to right. Betrothed on September 22nd, 1845, to Herr Bendix Grünlich, merchant of Hamburg. This matters because Tony hasn't told Grünlich, Tony hasn't told her father, Tony hasn't told anyone else that she's getting married now. The first thing she does is think, I'll write it in the family book. So it's actually basically a sort of performative act. She's creating this future by writing it in the family book first of all. Here, she plunges the pen into the ink. This is an impulsive decision. This represents her attitude to the marriage. It's sort of, what the hell? And this is the way she goes into the marriage. And we have this repeated, the crooked forefinger, her awkward handwriting. This is not a happy marriage, and indeed it ends in divorce. This is now her nephew Hanno, again interacting with the family book a generation later. Hanno looked at the manuscript sidewise, carelessly critical, a little contemptuous, and supremely indifferent. Then, with thoughtless care, mechanically and dreamily, he made with the gold pen a beautiful, clean double line diagonally across the entire page, the upper one a little stronger than the lower, just as he had been taught to embellish every page of his arithmetic book. Then his father later comes in and discovers this. "What possessed you to do such a mischievous thing?" cried the senator. And little Johann stammered, I thought there was nothing else coming." So not only does Hanno actually, he's implicitly gay, he's implicitly in love with his school friend, he doesn't have any interest in continuing in the family business, he doesn't want to get married and have children, he thinks the family ends with him, he's much more like his mother, he's musically inclined, he's a typical man-artist figure, by man, I mean Thomas Mann, not man figure. And here he is basically anticipating the future and putting an end to the Buddenbrooks lineage, and indeed this prophecy comes true. Buddenbrooks also has, between the characters of Tony and Hanno, symbolic returns. So, as I mentioned earlier, C is a symbol of freedom, of love, and of timelessness, as opposed to the duty and constraint of work and school back in the town at home. Both of the characters, over different generations, the characters go to Travemünde, I think it's mentioned explicitly, this seaside resort where basically they're free to enjoy the summer holidays, life is paused, and they can enjoy themselves for once as opposed to being bound by duty. As Tony, the young Tony, as a teenager, is leaving the seaside resort. This is what happens. This is what she sees and the narrator describes. Tony pressed her head into the corner of the coach and looked out of the window. The morning sky was covered with white clouds. The Trave broke into little waves that rushed out from the wind. Now and then, drops of rain pattered against the glass. At the end of the front, people sat in their house doorways and mended nets. Barefoot children came running and looked curiously at the carriage. They were staying here. So what we have here is an apparently subjective, intimate moment, Tony's despair at having to leave the place she loves and to return home to the duty she hates. The final line, this emphasis, the italics on they were staying here, adds to this sense of this is Tony's perspective, the people outside are other, they get to remain here on holiday, or this is where they live, effectively. 500 or 600 pages later, Hanno, her nephew, several decades on, also leaves Travemünde to go home. And this is the description. Hanno pressed his head into the corner of the coach and looked out of the window. The morning sky was covered with white clouds. The Trave broke into little waves that rushed back from the wind. Now and then, drops of rain pattered against the glass. At the end of the front, people sat in their house doorways and mended nets. Barefoot children came running and looked curiously at the carriage. They were staying here. What's anyone notice about these two? Here and there. Who is it said that? Yes, exactly. Apart from that, they are identical. Interestingly, the pretty awful translation I took this from translated these two passages in totally different ways, so just randomly different ways. They hadn't noticed the identical description that we have here across a gap of 500 or 600 pages. This is probably a bit of a shame for Thomas Mann. But this isn't coincidence, obviously. He didn't just have these words kind of rolling around his mind and make use of them again, however long later. The only difference, as you correctly pointed out, is that the waves rushed back when before they rushed out. Implicitly here, only a second or two has passed. We've just got the waves going in and coming out again. So what does this mean? This apparently subjective, personal, unique moment is actually, in some respects, being imposed by the narrator. The narrator is homogenizing these distinct identities. At most, however, readers would probably have a sense that we've seen something like this before. They probably wouldn't notice it. Indeed, I think my PhD supervisor said anyone with anything better to do wouldn't notice it. It's nice of him. But anyway, so what we have here is at most a subliminal message occurring. And this binds the different generations together across massively distinct times. So in these three works, we have the suggestion of continuity over time, but also change. Orange is the New Black and The Godfather have flashbacks to flesh out the characters' past, to give them context and backgrounds. But Buddenbrooks achieves this in a subtler way through symbolic returns and symbolic anticipations of the future. Together, this suggests changing times and changing characters, but it also foreshadows the downfalls. And as I said at the start, they all start from a point of excitement and hope for the future, and this effectively spells a kind of future doom. So to conclude, what we have in these three works is very similar constructions, despite their differences, of business, life, family tensions, and structures of power. It tells us about how individuals operate in social groups, but also how power may be challenged and changed over time. So some characters may resist the imposition of power and then become part of the system. So we saw this in Michael Corleone in The Godfather and also Tony Buddenbrook. But others resist and are destroyed by the system. So, for example, Hanno Buddenbrook, who chooses to submit to typhoid, and Pusey, who is beaten and ejected from the family. But also, This suggests how society is reflected in cultural production in different ways. Perspective is key to all three works. You've got unconscious manipulations of language, camera angles, colours, symbols, sounds, and so on, that change how we view the different characters. So this is all part of a wider project I'm doing, which brings together canonical works of literature and aspects of contemporary culture. So what's it all about? Well, I'm questioning why it is that some works of contemporary culture are so popular. What are they doing so well that excites us? And why are some works of literature considered great? Why do they stand the test of time? And in general, I want to explore what this might tell us about experience and social identity more generally. So I'm also writing a series of newspaper articles, the first of which came out in The Independent this week on Bodyguard and the Count of Monte Cristo. I've got another one coming out on The Bridge and Wilkie Collins, if these are things that you're interested in. And I've also got a question to you about how you can help with this. Because this is about popular works of culture, I'd like to put out there, are there particular works that you love and you think should be analysed in this way, should be compared to canonical works of literature? If so, please tweet me. I've just joined Twitter, especially for this, about a month ago, so I don't know how to use it yet. But if you do, please tweet me or send me an old-fashioned email, and you can also find me on Google to do that. Thanks very much for listening.